Welcome back. This is the fourth video for Chapter 7, Arrays. And in this video, we're going to look at how to process arrays. In other words, how to access the elements and do things to the stuff that are inside arrays. So, if we need to do something to single elements, we access them with the array name and an index and some square brackets. So if my array is named A, I access the first element in the array by square bracket 0. So now if this is an array of ints, then this specification is an int. It's just the first int in the array A. I don't have to put a literal in the square brackets. I can put a variable or anything that evaluates to an integer expression. So this example shows me accessing element I of the array A. Okay, and again, if this array is an array of ints, then A sub I is an int. So anything I could do to an int, I could do to A sub I. Now, generally speaking, processing doesn't have built-in operations that work on entire arrays. One exception is the print line method. We've seen that actually will accept an array as a parameter and print out all of the elements of the array. But generally speaking, if we want to do something to every element of the array, we almost always have to use the for loop to do that. So make sure that you know how a for loop works, because we need it a lot. Here's a template. So if an array named A, we're going to set up a for loop like this. We'll start with an index variable. Generally speaking, we use I. It's just tradition. If we want to start at the first part of the array, we need to start that at 0, not at 1, because the first element of an array is 0. We need to keep going as long as I is less than the length of that array, and we access that via the .length field, and we'll go up by 1. Okay, so what this will do is it'll take us through every element of the array one after the other, starting at element 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and so on, all the way up through the last element in the array. Obviously, in the body of the loop, then, we'll be doing something to that element. We'll look at some examples in a bit to see how that might work. Now, before we get on to looking at those examples, let's talk about bounds checking. Processing checks array bounds because it's based on Java, but that's not true of every language. So what that means is, if I try to specify an index that's less than 0 or greater than the index of the last element in the array, my program will crash. I'll get what's called an array index out of bounds exception. So let's look at how that might work with a real quick example. Alright, in this example we're going to see what happens when I access outside the bounds of the array. So quickly, I'm going to type up an example. Okay. So what this example does is, first of all, declare and initialize an array of booleans, so 50 booleans, and they should all be initialized to false because of the default values in processing. And now what my intent here is with this for loop is to go through and set all of those values to true. So maybe for some reason I need the values in this array to be true before I do more work with them. So this for loop is intended to do that. Can you spot the error though? This isn't going to work right. Yep, it's right there. I'm going to less than or equal to the length of the array, but since arrays start at 0, the last element would actually be the length minus 1, and so my very last iteration of this is going to give me an error. Now watch what happens when I try to run it. There we go. Down here it shows me my error message that my array index is out of bounds. It shows me what the number was, 50, and this is the line where it happened. So whenever you step outside the bounds of an array, you'll see an exception like that. That happens if I go too far to the right, that is a number that's too big, Or if I try to go less than 0, I will have a similar issue. Okay? So this for loop should be start at 0 and go less than array.length. And now it operates correctly. Now let's look at some things that are actually useful and not errors. First of all, let's take an example where we're going to look at an array of floats and try to compute the average value in that array. Okay, in this example, what we're going to do is take an array of floats and find the average value of the items in that array. So first, let's create an array of floats and fill it with some random numbers. Okay, so that will create an array of 50 floats, give them values between 0 and 100. We can test that real quick by printing it out. Oops, we need to spell that correctly, I guess. And down in our console, there's our random values. Okay, now let's go ahead and add some code to get the average of that array. So here's the idea. I'm going to keep a sum variable that counts or keeps track of the total running total of all the elements in that array. Then I'm going to use a for loop that is in turn going to add each of the elements in the array to the sum. And finally, I will compute the average, which will be the sum divided by the number of elements in my array. Then I can print that out and see what we get. Okay, so out of 50 things, random things between 0 and 100, our average is 51, so that seems reasonable. What if we make this larger? Make it 5,000. And again, our average is cleared near to 50, which makes me confident that my average code is working correctly. Lastly, for our last example in the video, let's take an array of ints and let's do a search of sorts. Let's find the index of the smallest element that's in that array. Okay, in this example, what we're going to do is look at an array of ints and find the index of the smallest value in that array. So we'll start in a similar way to the last example, except I'll make an array of ints and then fill it with some random numbers. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We create an array of 10 ints here. Then in the for loop, go through the array, look at each element, set it to a random integer between 0 and 100. The int method takes a float and makes it into an int by chopping off its fractional components. And then just to test real quick, we'll print it out. Okay, so there's my integer array. And what I want to do now is search that array and try to find the index of the smallest thing. In this case, 4, because that's the index where the first 4 occurs. Obviously, the contents will be different each time, so we'll want to take that into account when we run or create our algorithm. Okay, so I'm going to need the index of the smallest thing, and that's what I'm trying to update. What I'm going to do then is also keep track of the actual smallest value, and we'll start that off with the index that we've set as our default. So in other words, we're going to assume that the first thing in the array is the smallest thing in the array. And now we're going to use a for loop to see if we can find anything smaller. Okay, so what we're going to do is every time we look at an array element, ask a question with an if statement. And say, if that element is less than my smallest value, then what I want to do is make that my new smallest value by keeping track of that variable I. So that's my new smallest, and updating my smallest value. Okay? So after that loop is complete, I'll have looked at everything in the array, and if it's smaller than the smallest thing so far, keep track of it. It becomes my new smallest thing so far. Now what happens when I print that out? We'll just print it out and see what we get. Okay, so in our console window, it says that my smallest value happens to be at index 6, and in this case it is. Let's try it again. Now it says my smallest value is at index 5, and 21 is indeed the smallest thing in the array. And again. And now my smallest thing happened to be the very first thing in the array. Element 8 or element 0 is got a value of 8. Okay, now typically we would take the types of things we did in this example and the previous one and put them in methods, but in order to do that effectively we need to pass variable or arrays as parameters. And so we need to look at passing arrays as parameters and using them as return values. And that will be the topic of the next video.